Superman is notable for a lot of reasons. The first real superhero, the first use of a proper dual identity, and unlike the heroes that came before him, he was really well developed. But the issue is that he had so many superpowers that it nearly made him unbeatable. This created a problem for writers because even his everyday villain of the week stories, the villains there needed to be somewhat capable and much more powerful than the average person. Enter DC's Atomic Skull, who has become one of Superman's more notable C-list villains. So join me as we shed some light on this villain, whose only fault really is just being a villain for the Man of Steel.
Check it out.
Hey guys, this is Dan on Gkanthology, and for this video I want to get back into working on my character focused videos. I usually tend to focus on the weird characters in the DC's magical side, and more recently, some of Batman's villainous alternate versions, but for this video I want to focus on a Superman villain that doesn't get too much attention, the Atomic Skull. But why the Atomic Skull, you ask? Well, there are a couple reasons. The easy one is that I opened up my DC encyclopedia to a random page and picked the Atomic Skull. But the other reason is that I want to explore some of the weirder and more obtuse Superman villains. Everyone raves about Batman's rogues galleries or Spider-Man's rogues, and the reasoning is quite simple. Villains have much more depth when compared to other heroes' villains. Some of the villains are mundane and monster of the week, and more accurately, they're filler villains. They fill in the gaps between larger stories, and at times can be a one-shot story, but rarely does a full storyline revolve around them, as opposed to classic villains like the Joker or Green Goblin, who can span multiple issues or larger crossovers. Added to that, these characters are so well developed that at times they can be featured in their own stories, or expand further and become entirely their own, like how Venom evolved from wanting to revenge on Spider-Man to the King in Black storyline, which made Venom and his story a core aspect of the larger Marvel universe. Some Superman villains have this effect, like Lex Luthor, Brainiac, or Doomsday, but arguably a fair amount of his villains fall into the filler category more often than not. And that's not because they're uninteresting characters. In fact, some of these villains have really great backstories, like Metallo or Parasite, but they tend to show up after their initial appearances in villain team-ups or as henchmen for other more important villains. The reality is that the only fault of these villains have is that they are tied to Superman himself. Superman is near unbeatable, and it's difficult to really find someone believable and compelling enough who is not overly powerful in some way to be on the same level as him. This is a Superman problem because even relatively powerful individuals are average in comparison to Superman. This brings us to the Atomic Skull, and the idea behind going into more detail on the Atomic Skull is one, he is genuinely interesting, and the other one is that I hope in speaking about these minor villains that more people will look to read these stories and maybe get these villains in the spotlight. So who is the Atomic Skull? Well, as any DC fan knows, there's usually multiple versions of the character, not including alternate universe characters. Usually this falls into pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths, post-Crisis, New 52, and now the DC Rebirth, and so on. Thankfully for this video and my sanity, we only have two versions of the character to go over. So this video shouldn't be too complicated. Surely I won't regret any of this. Before the Crisis on Infinite Earths, Albert Michaels worked for Star Labs but was also working for the criminal organization Skull. Michaels had a medical condition which led him to having seizures that would escalate in intensity, eventually leading to his death unless he took corrective action. Some real-world research shows that the condition called sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, or SUDEP, can cause death in patients who suffer from epilepsy. And this can happen without any reasonable explanation, which some research estimates is the reason for 8 to 17% of seizure deaths, and for patients that do not respond to regular treatment, they have roughly a 50% increased chance of dying from this condition. While I'm not sure whether this had anything to do with his creation or his backstory, it does add an interesting motivation for his later actions. While at Star Labs, he would smuggle tech to Skull, where they intended to use it in an effort to defeat Superman. During a conflict with Metallo and Superman, Michael's identity as a corporate spy was revealed, forcing him to flee. After this, Skull offered him a solution for his condition through the use of a neural implant powered by radium, which was created in order to control his seizures. When he was implanted with a device, shortly later it stopped working and had the side effect of externalizing his seizures, giving him the ability to project the bioelectricity from his epileptic brain into electric blast. Using this ability, he overthrows the Skull organization and becomes a new leader, focusing his efforts on defeating Superman. This plan didn't go well though, as Superman thwarted his scheme and put him in a correctional facility. The prison he was sent to was designed to use a villain's power against them to power their own cells. In the case of Atomic Skull, his bioelectricity channeled through a helmet powered the security of his cell. Atomic Skull would break out of prison a couple more times and make a few appearances, including a crossover with The Flash and another instance where he had to fight Superman and Man-Bat. His last known appearance in the pre-52 era of comics was in the lead up to the Infinite Crisis, where he tried to convince a gang of teenagers to detonate a chlorine gas bomb in Metropolis, but was defeated by the Birds of Prey.
Why did you attack those people?
To draw out the main course, of course.
You used them for bait?
Give me a break. I do what I do, you do what you do.
Joe Martin first appeared in Action Comics number 670 in 1991. He was a university student whose metagene was activated during an alien invasion. A metagene is sort of like DC's answers to mutant, and usually is a quick and easy explanation as to why someone gets powers. Unlike the X gene, which tends to activate during puberty, the metagene is more like writer's choice, such as times during trauma, exposure to weird stuff, or in Martin's case, the alien invasion. Martin was transformed into a radiation-seeking monster with a flaming skull, and decided to take the name of the Atomic Skull based on an old hero from a movie serial he used to watch when he was younger, but he did this not knowing that there was another Atomic Skull around. That being said, the Albert Michaels version disappeared for a bit during this time, and the Martin version became the primary version of Atomic Skull, which appeared in several animated shows and movies including the Justice League Unlimited series, Superman vs. the Elite, and he's also scheduled to appear in the newest Superman show, My Adventures with Superman. This version of Skull tends to be the one people see more often. After acquiring his powers, he attacks Superman, seeing him as the villain and himself as the hero. This was during the time Superman had his electric powers, and so in his mind he saw Superman as the evil Dr. Electron, which was the villain in the movie serial where Martin got the name of the Atomic Skull from. So let's start with the New 52. After an editorial decision to basically restart the DC universe in order to let new readers come in without all the baggage, Flashpoint was turned into a Crisis-like event that reshaped the long-standing characters in DC with a more modern characterization. Atomic Skull was reintroduced in the first Action Comics annual of the new era in a backup piece where we learned that this universe's Atomic Skull was a Star Lab scientist whose jealousy got the best of him. He was involved with a co-worker who he loved deeply, but when he saw her dancing with another co-worker, he ended up killing her and burying her in a shallow grave. 'Cause that's the thing to do. Anyway, sometime later he was working on an experimental Star Lab submarine that crashed due to a blast of nuclear energy, which he was also exposed to. Shipwrecked on the island, he found that he can emit nuclear blasts from his mouth, which he used to protect himself from predators on the island. Eventually, after repeated use, his skin and muscles literally peeled off his face, exposing the skull, leading him to calling himself the Atomic Skull, and becoming a regular Superman villain much like his pre-Crisis counterpart. Eventually he reforms and starts working for good with instances of helping Superman and other heroes like Green Lantern. Fun fact, this little introduction had no dialogue, but was rather just panels of art telling a story coordinated by screenwriter Max Landis. Landis, if you remember, wrote scripts for the movie Chronicle as well as American Ultra. Landis also happens to be the son of movie director John Landis, who directed classics like Animal House,
Boone.
It's not gonna be an orgy. It's a toga party.
and An American Werewolf in London.
I know. A monster.
Some of you may remember his video on YouTube where he summarized the editorial decision and the story behind the death and return of Superman storyline. He was also hired to pitch a modern version of the storyline that was intended to be a limited series like the New 52, but was cancelled due to scheduling conflicts. During an interview with Comic Vine, he was asked which version of the Skull this is, and he responds, "Yeah, I'm sort of doing a new version of the guy, and I definitely see using the Al name." This is where the confusion starts for me because I can't really find any proof from DC of who this version of the character is supposed to be. And before you all tell me that I have no idea what I'm talking about, I literally went through all the comics he appeared in. But hey, if I'm wrong, let me know. So first things first, I did a search on DC.com. And guess what? Nothing. I guess they couldn't be bothered to clear things up. The next thing would be to look at my DC encyclopedia. And there's been 2 additions since Flashpoint, including one after DC Rebirth. And they all point to Joseph Martin being in the New 52 version of the character that seems to be an amalgamation of the 2 pre-Flashpoint versions. In fact, in Action Comics Volume Number 2, Issue 32, Skull comes in conflict with Steel, who identifies him as Martin. Okay, clear cut, it has to be Martin, what are you talking about? Get over with, move on. Until you get to the Superwoman series, where Steel here seems to be a common factor, but he mentions Michaels by name, indicating that the Atomic Skull is the Albert version. One thing to note here is that there's a difference in character design which kinda helps. The big bulky Atomic Skull looks to be Martin, and the more slimmed down version is presumably Albert Michaels. This is fine, until you get to Teen Titans issues 20 and 33 of the 6th volume, where you clearly see a slimmed down Atomic Skull similar to the Albert design locked up by Robin. Later on, you see Robin looking at a monitor with all the villains, and it identifies Skull as Joey Marino, aka Joe Martin or Joseph Martin. Not done yet, and if you followed me up to this point, thanks. I'd like you to hit that like button and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more of my work, because you can enjoy more random videos like this one. Now, in issue 9 of the Batman Superman series, Atomic Skull shows up again, this time controlled by Ultra Human Knight and implanted with a detonation device which catches the attention of Batman, who is able to identify him as the Albert Michaels version, and tries to help him since Atomic Skull at this point is pretty much reformed, or should be anyway. But before Batman could help, Atomic Skull blows up in front of Batman and in the middle of Gotham. Don't ask me how Batman survived, because the answer is and will always be because he's Batman. But the storyline is interesting, and even has Batman being turned into an Atomic Skull version of himself, which is pretty cool. The last piece of evidence is a blurb from the McFarlane line of DC Multiverse Comics. 1. The Atomic Skull looks more like the Albert Michaels version, but here's a blurb. Atomic Skull, real name, Joseph Martin. While on an experimental Starlab submarine, scientist Joseph Martin was exposed to nuclear energy. Shipwrecked on a desert island, he survived by releasing deadly nuclear blasts from his mouth. His skin and muscles literally peeled off, inspiring him to create the supervillain for hire persona, Atomic Skull. He regularly clashed with Superman both alone and with criminals such as Major Disaster, the Royal Flush Gang, and in recent times, Martin reformed fighting criminals with the Metropolis Special Crimes Unit, Superwoman, and the Teen Titans. So is it an editorial mistake? Maybe they just don't give a damn. But the problem is, I think writers just forgot which is which and just used whatever name they remembered. Argument could be said that when the DC Rebirth was done that both versions came back, but that's a cop-out due to poor writing and planning considering the way the appearances were managed. That's not to say he's a bad character. He could easily be the focus of a movie and a future Superman movie or a Superman adjacent character film. Who knows? He's still pretty interesting and definitely one of those villains that people tend to forget about unless you see him on a panel or anime series, because it's only until then you remember that he actually exists. But this is a common problem with some Superman villains like Metallo or Parasite, although when they are used correctly, they can be pivotal to plot points like in the Batman Superman storyline that I described earlier. That being said, thanks for watching. Leave a comment down below letting me know what you think and if I'm completely wrong here, and if DC confirmed it, because even with all the research I did, I could have missed it. But for now, take care and have an awesome day. I appreciate you guys watching. If you want to see more about DC, check out this video on the Grim Knight. And if Ninja Turtles is your thing, check this video out.